Good morning, my name's Dean Godson. I'm Director of Policy Exchange. My pleasure to be your host today here for this important in-conversation between Jeremy Hunt and Bill Gates. They'll be discussing a wide range of national and international issues ranging from responses to the pandemic, foreign aid, through to climate change. We're delighted, as always, at Policy Exchange to be at the heart of national and international debate, and I know that the discussion today will not disappoint you. Over to you, Jeremy and Bill. Thank you.
This is the final interview in a series of interviews focused on the future of liberal democracies. And we're delighted to have as our guest Bill Gates, who is someone who knows more than most how technology can change the rules of the game. But he's actually in London because it's not just technology, it's also climate that can change the rules of that game. And he's here for COP26. He's also written a book on climate change that was published this year. So thank you very much for joining us. Could I start by reflecting on something you say in your book? You say this is going to be hard. We need cooperation with China, which is the world's biggest emitter, and relations aren't great there. We depend on technologies that haven't yet been invented, problems that haven't been solved, and yet you say you're an optimist. Why the optimism with these huge challenges?
Well, in 2015, we didn't have a focus on innovation, and the cause was not talked about that much. And even a sophisticated print magazine like The Economist sort of thought, okay, solar prices are coming down, maybe that makes this something that's easy to solve. So I'll say in the last 6 years, the understanding that there are these many sources of emissions and that we're going to have to orchestrate a lot of money, including innovation money, to be able to do things in this clean way without the prices having to go up very dramatically, that's improved a lot. Now we have to stay on that learning curve. This is very tough, and if we don't innovate, even in the rich countries, the costs that we'd be asking citizens to bear could get to the point where the consensus, that because we're avoiding such dramatic harms in the future, that it's worth, changing transport, changing industry, changing agriculture in order to take emissions, which, are still going up right now. We could damage that. It is one of the few problems you need the entire world to work together on. And yet, young people are very animated by the cause. The coverage, the bad weather events we're seeing, the difficulties for particularly the poorest are more evident than ever. So I am hopeful, but it's because of partly my history in my first career seeing software and digital innovation, and then in my foundation career seeing new vaccines, new drugs, cutting childhood deaths from 10 million a year to 5 million a year, that I bring a view that if you orchestrate the innovation in the right way, that we can get to zero.
But could I put it to you, your background as a technology entrepreneur, you've seen how that's transformed the world. But in that transformation driven by the internet, there wasn't a specific change that needed to happen. There wasn't a deadline. But we have scientists who say that we are going to reach that tipping point of 1.5 degrees by 2040 at the moment on current projections. So it is different this time. There is that time pressure.
That's right. There's no comparable feat that mankind has ever achieved to what we need to do for climate change. Now, mankind is much richer today, far more knowledgeable today. We do have the digital tools that enable us to work on these things. There are people who document the history of the industrial economy, people like Václav Smil, who say, look, the rate of change that has ever happened, here you're expecting to go almost 4 times faster. And the benefit of the change in most cases isn't that visible. It's not like when we shifted, to natural gas or other advances. So yes, people can be skeptical if they want to be, and yet, as I'm going out to rich individuals raising money for breakthrough energy, as I'm going out to companies to raise money for breakthrough energy, I've actually found it easier than I expected. And now Breakthrough Energy is partnering with governments, including the UK government, to fund projects. What happened with solar panels, where they were very expensive and now they're cheap, or lithium-ion batteries, we need to do that for about 6 other technologies. Green steel, cheap hydrogen, offshore wind. And so it does require lots of money, and we have many paths of innovation. We're not just counting on one path, but we will have to see rapid innovation. It's all a matter of degrees, so to speak. That is, hitting 2.5 is better than hitting 3. Hitting 2 is better than hitting 2.5. 1.5 will be very difficult. I doubt that we'll be able to achieve that.
Okay. Now, you've done a lot of work over the last 15 years in the developing world through the foundation. Let's just think about their perspective. What do we say to countries like China and India who say, look, yeah, sure, our emissions overall are bigger than a countries like Britain's or even a countries like America's, but per capita, our emissions are much less, and you guys got rich by generating lots of emissions. Isn't it reasonable for us to do exactly the same?
Yes, the middle-income countries, which is where most people in the world live, over 65%. The richest middle-income country is China, the poorest is India. They are key to climate. Most of the emissions in the world come from middle-income countries. And so the rich countries have to do 2 things. We have to get rid of our own emissions, but we also, because we have the majority of all the innovation power, the great universities, the risk capital, that's in the rich countries. The innovation to reduce the cost of green products, what I call the green premium, which, save for cement. Green cement costs twice as much. Green aviation fuel costs twice as much. Through innovation, the rich countries have to bring that down so dramatically that we can turn to, say, India and say, okay, yes, you're still building basic shelter for your citizens, and we can't tell you to do that at half the rate because you're buying expensive cement. We have to make that green premium either very small, like less than 10%, or actually 0. And in some cases, like electric cars, with another 10 to 15 years of progress, costs going down, charge times going down, range going up, in the space of passenger cars, we'll have a negative green premium. That is, the clean product will actually cost less if you're buying a new one than the polluting product. And so we have to do that across the board. We cannot afford to subsidize the green premiums of the middle-income countries. That would be trillions of dollars. For the low-income countries that are about 3 or 4% of emissions, yes, it is possible that you could step up there, but we need to make it easy enough that India decides to participate. Now, India and China are closer to the equator than the UK and the US, and so actually the problems they have in terms of the water supply coming off the Himalayas, the south of India, you won't be able to work outdoors in the summer. You won't be able to farm, do construction. And so even though they have so many near-term issues, they're not as much of an advocate in this. Over time, you'll see that change as they realize, wow, they are more in trouble than the temperate zone countries.
But let's take, you talk about India, let's just talk about China for a moment. Now, they burn half the world's coal. How do we, as Western countries, deal robustly with things like human rights abuses in Xinjiang, what's happening in Hong Kong, whilst at the same time securing their cooperation on climate goals, which frankly won't succeed without it?
Well, the degree of outsiders to influence what goes on in China is easy to overestimate across any issue. But climate is a tragedy of the commons issue. That is, China itself will actually have more of a problem than the rich countries. So, and China does care. Right now, if the US asks them to do something, I can't say whether that would encourage them to do it or to do exactly the opposite. But they value their relationships with the UK, with Europe, with their neighbors in Asia. And so they're not going to be rogue on this. They are a large part of emissions right now. They've gone through, the infrastructure part. Now their economy, as they grow further, it'll be more of a services type growth. So it'll peak and go down somewhat, but they'll have to change their steel plants and their cement plants. And, I do think they're taking it seriously. They reduce local pollution faster than any rich country ever did. Cleaning up those coal plants. They want to get rid of the coal plants. And, how do we push them ahead? And we may have to make trade-offs in terms of our relationships with China and decide, okay, what are our priorities and what is realistic?
We'll come back to that, but just let me ask you something now about Western consumers. So, for example, the people I represent in Southwest Surrey, they might well say when it comes to the climate agenda, look, I'd love to have an electric car, but they are more expensive than other cars. I'd like to go on to a green tariff for my electricity, but it's more expensive than the standard tariffs. I'd like to double glaze or triple glaze the windows in my house, but it's expensive. So, to paraphrase St. Augustine, I'd like to be virtuous, but not yet. What do you say to the idea that it's easier for wealthier people to preach that we need to change our lifestyles, but it's actually much more challenging for people on limited budgets?
Absolutely. I mean, that's sadly true of almost everything, like dealing with the pandemic and so many of the challenges. And so calibrating how we shift these markets and, either in terms of taxes or somewhat higher prices, how we move to most of the heating being done with electricity, and that electricity is green. When should we make it so that you can't buy a new gasoline or petrol car and you have to buy an electric car? These are judgments. And, in the car case, it's pretty clear in 10 to 15 years that even the person with a tight budget won't view that as a negative trade-off. Today, yes, it's mostly people with more money and some virtue signaling, a little bit of tax credit. It's only a few percent of the overall car market, but we need to drive that up. I'd say the roadmap there is more clear. Shifting to solar and wind, that hasn't increased prices much. I mean, offshore wind costs a little bit more, but over time the innovation will bring that down. Sadly, today we have this natural gas price peak that will, somebody's going to pay more for electricity. The policies around that will be very complex. But the climate movement has to be realistic. People are committed to work on climate change. But if we ask them to do too much, like the Yellow Vest movement in France, that was partly, not entirely caused by a diesel price increase that made sense from a climate point of view, those people said, why me? Why, the person who lives far outside the city and may not have the same income as the person in the city? Why should I bear these transitional costs? My answer to everything, whether it's, saving lives or, eradicating malaria or climate, is that innovation is the only kind of way that you get to have modest sacrifices be made and yet achieve the super important goal, which for climate is zero emissions.
So I want to ask you about pandemic preparedness as well, but just before that, some slightly more UK specific things. I was Foreign Secretary when we secured COP26 for the UK. I was very proud to do so. You, in your book, gave a very precise definition of success when it comes to the climate crisis. We've got to get 51 billion tons of greenhouse gases down to zero. What would your precise definition of success be for COP26?
Well, COP26 is super important, and I thank the UK for hosting it. They've put very capable people on it. The climate movement is a very broad movement. I mean, you have people who don't believe in capitalism, people who think it can be solved overnight. So herding that all together is very difficult. But it will be a milestone where the world can look at it and say, okay, since Paris, how have we done on our near-term goals? How are we doing on innovation? What are these remaining areas of emissions? And people realize, although a lot of good stuff has happened in the last 6 years, it's still not enough. We need that meeting because in people's daily lives, they don't get an update on how things are going. And this is a cooperative construct.
But
people will come out of the meeting and say, no, we still don't, the commitments aren't strong enough, the innovation isn't strong enough. And that's good. That has to be one of the outcomes of the meeting, is we see where the deficits are.
And how about the UK? How are we doing on climate issues? I mean, we've reduced emissions more than any other G20 country, but there are lots of things we haven't done as well. What's your outsider's view as to how well we're doing?
The UK actually is exemplary. Coal started here, and yet there's periods of time when the coal emissions in the UK are zero. Even over the years period, it's a few percent, and there's a plan to literally get that to zero. The UK has helped bootstrap some of the new technologies. So, for example, this cost for difference way of bidding out the offshore wind, that's a great capacity for the UK. And as those costs come down, that doesn't just benefit the UK, that benefits every other country. And offshore wind is going to play a big role in that much larger power generation network of the future on a global basis. I admit I was worried when they merged the climate department and the business department. I thought, okay, will climate get lost in that? In fact, the right thing happened, which is more business-oriented analytical thinking came together with people who understood the climate. And that, I think, is why the UK has made progress on this. The department sees challenges, like if nuclear was cheap and there was a super accepted design, they know that that's good, and yet most of the offerings today are super expensive. And so, where in the world is there innovation? I have a company that's going to try and collaborate with them, see if we can help out on that. No, the UK gets a very good grade on climate progress.
And more generally, you've been a friend of the UK for many, many years. We've had a lot of political turbulence, a big change in our relations with the EU with Brexit. What do you see Britain's role in the world, Britain's contribution to the world post-Brexit?
Yeah, the Gates Foundation has a number of amazing partnerships here in the UK, and it's made a huge difference. We have a partnership with what was called DFID, I guess now is just recently now part of the FCDO. We have Wellcome Trust, who's an incredible organization that we partner with. We've spent over the last 5 years over £1 billion on UK academic centers because they have incredible expertise, and that's true all over the country. We've got Edinburgh doing great livestock work, Liverpool doing these mind-blowing bed nets that are saving hundreds of thousands of lives. Obviously we do a lot with the London School, with Imperial, with Oxford, with Cambridge. So the virtuous cycle where the UK is committed to aid in helping poor countries through the DFID budget, which was increased all the way up to 0.7% of GDP. Unfortunately, it's now down at 0.5%. But it really focused on the poorest. So the overlap with the DFID goals and our foundation's goals was almost total. So we worked together. Our proudest achievement was the creation of the Gavi, the vaccine fund, which alone has saved millions of lives. I'd say our second proudest achievement is the Global Fund, where the UK, after the US, is the biggest funder, and that has made huge progress on malaria, TB, and HIV. And we have a lot of new tools coming into that, including a malaria vaccine that was largely done here in the UK. So, we hope that the UK is proud of that. As a percentage of tax payments, it's not a huge percentage, but particularly in health, I wish everybody could go and see the impact, of half as many kids dying before the age of 5, since the year 2000 when that all got started.
I mean, you're obviously disappointed about the 0.7% cut, but are you still optimistic about Britain's future?
Well, yes, the institutions that we partner with that are doing the work, all the ones I named, continue to do great work. And so I hope the consensus that the UK shows up, and is thought of in terms of the quality of its aid, the impact of its aid, is allowing amazing things like Gavi or Global Fund to get done. I hope that remains. The fact that we're going to be down at 0.5 for a while means prioritizing and being even more ruthless about which ones are high impact. The fact that it's now part of a department, hopefully the imperative to prioritize the benefits of the poor stays very, very strong in that budget. So, it's been an amazing partnership. This transition is a little bit of a concern, but the basic impact of what's been done, I can't say enough that, the UK voters should be proud and what that's meant for how the UK is perceived in the world.
Let me move to just broadly onto, and finally more briefly onto some broader geopolitics questions. So earlier in this series, I interviewed Dr. Henry Kissinger, and he told me that he was worried about what he called the First World War risk, where you ended up with a military conflict between China and the United States that was almost accidental. Neither side wanted it, but both sides got sucked into it, as happened in the First World War, without actually seeing a way out. How do we manage relations between the world's two big superpowers to avoid that accidental conflict?
Well, I think it's very important not to analogize the US-Soviet conflict to the US-China conflict. Even the word conflict, I don't like to use there, because the Soviet Union had a goal of changing the economic system on a global basis, and they funded activities to go and change, get rid of capitalism, basically. China's interests are largely domestic. Now, we have a few things that have to do with North Korea, South China Sea, and Taiwan, where you could trigger a physical conflict, and if you're not careful about those things. But overall, the Chinese are not trying to change the U.S. economic system. They're not, they're not trying to control North America as part of some conquered territory or anything like that. So I worry a lot that people are using that framework and not seeing the opportunities in areas of, terrorism, climate, medical innovation, that in fact it's a win-win. The fact that Chinese incomes have gone up, Chinese education, even some high-quality universities are there, that's great for the world. That is a good thing. because we're not trying to control each other's territory.
And Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister of Australia, someone else I interviewed in this series, he said that if we're going to preach democracy abroad, we've got to fix the problems at home. And often in that context, people talk about the technology industry, and particularly the way social media, with its algorithms, can accentuate extreme views and accentuate divisions. How, if we're thinking about the functioning of our own democracies, do we make sure the technology industry is a force for good rather than a force for bad?
Yeah, I'd say that during the pandemic, we saw a lot of false information. That probably led to some of the mask hesitancy and vaccine hesitancy. So that's unfortunate. And the digital realm, there's always been crazy theories and conspiracy theories. It probably was spread more efficiently because of the digital realm. And the various providers that were a little slow, putting them in the position of deciding, okay, what stuff should circulate, what stuff should not, may not be the right solution. It may be that governments need to step up. But acting like, if Facebook was just virtuous all of a sudden, you'd have complete clarity of what should be allowed and what's not allowed. I don't think that's realistic. So, eventually governments will decide. Wild conspiracy theories, do they have to be double checked? Do they have to slow down their spread? Do you have to put counterbalancing point of views there? This is not, just complaining about the private sector is not going to lead to a solution. I admit there is a problem.
Okay. We could talk for a long time about that, but
Sure.
I do want to talk to you finally about pandemic preparedness, because you gave some very stark warnings after Ebola that we needed to act fast for the next pandemic. That didn't become a global pandemic, but it could have done. And your warnings weren't heeded, or some of them were heeded, but many of them weren't. Do you think world leaders are listening this time? And are we doing things now, or rather are we not doing things now that we really need to be doing in preparation for the next pandemic?
Yeah, so it was 2015 that I gave the TED Talk and wrote a number of papers titled "We're Not Ready for the Next Pandemic." And sadly, that was a better forecast of what would happen than anyone would have wished for. The economic damage, the deaths, it's been completely horrific. And I would expect that will lead the R&D budgets to be focused on things we didn't have today. We didn't have vaccines that block transmission. We got vaccines that help you with your health, but they only slightly reduce the transmissions. We need a new way of doing the vaccines. We didn't get much in the way of therapeutics. Dexamethasone and now molnupiravir could help, but way less than should have been the case. We didn't get the diagnostics up and running in order to achieve what at least Australia and New Zealand showed, that competent management could keep the death rate down pretty dramatically. And so I'm hoping in 5 years I can write a book called, We Are Ready for the Next Pandemic. But it'll take tens of billions in R&D that the US and the UK will be part of that. It'll take probably about $1 billion a year for a pandemic task force at the WHO level, which is doing the surveillance and actually doing what I call germ games, where you practice. You say, okay, what if a bioterrorist brought smallpox to 10 airports? How would the world respond to that? That there's naturally caused epidemics and bioterrorism caused epidemics that could even be way worse than what we experience today. And yet the advances in medical science should give us tools that we could do dramatically better. So you'd think this would be a priority. The next year will be where those allocations have to get made, including this global pandemic task force. The nice thing is a lot of the R&D we need to do to be ready for the next pandemic are things like making vaccines cheap, having big factories, eradicating the flu, getting rid of the common cold, making vaccines just a little patch you put on your arm, things that will be incredibly beneficial even in the years when we don't have pandemics. So, along with the climate message and the ongoing fight against disease of the poor, the pandemic preparedness is something I'll be talking about a lot. And I think it'll find fertile ground because, we lost trillions of dollars and millions of lives. And, citizens expect their governments not to let that happen again.
And finally, just from me, we've got young people watching this interview. You've had an extraordinary career in which you've been both the world's richest man and the world's biggest philanthropist. What advice would you give to young people about the right balance between material success and public service as they plot out their own careers?
Well, you can't, if you give enough money away, it's good. You're no longer get the visibility of being the richest. I'm super lucky. I mean, I loved computers and software. I had a great education. I got exposed to a very limited computer when I was 14 years old, and I became fascinated by that. So I've been lucky in my first career at Microsoft to have something that was fun and had impact and gave me the resources for the second career that includes the global health work and now also trying to make sure the climate doesn't set back the poor countries dramatically, because they're the ones that'll suffer the most. So, I read a lot. I was encouraged to be curious, and I think that's where the greatest contributions come from, is if you take your talent and surround yourself with people who understand those things, who are also pushing their knowledge, and hopefully people find a fulfilling career. And even if their career's not related to the needs of the poorest, they can volunteer, they have their political voice, they can go witness where things are going well and what we're still not doing. So I'm an optimist. I do think that this younger generation will come up with its view of what the priorities should be and tap in the increased innovation power of the world and solve those problems.
Bill Gates, thank you very much.